Hi, I'm Eric. I'm an inorganic chemist, assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. I'll tell you a little bit about the work my group does around porous materials. Uh, these include metal organic frameworks, coordination cages, and we're targeting applications from gas storage, separation, drug delivery, catalysis. As you can see up here, my group mostly focuses on metal organic frameworks and coordination cages. So metal organic frameworks, or MOFs, are these three-dimensional structures based on a metal cation, some organic bridging linker. You react these together and form a three-dimensional structure. So the structures can be very tunable, very high surface areas. You can put functional groups on the organic linkers that are in these structures. You can change the metal that are in these structures to change their properties. And a very common application for them, because they're such high surface area, is gas storage. So you can see three common MOFs right here: MOF 5, HCUS1, and metal DOBDC, or MOF 74. Their surface areas range from 1,500 to 5,000 meters squared per gram. So 1 gram, a pile in your hand the size of a penny, basically, has the same surface area as a football field, which is pretty impressive. So these high surface areas can be used to selectively absorb gas. So for example, if you took a gas cylinder, which is about the size of me, filled it up with CO2, if you instead filled it up with MOF, or packed metal organic framework, in the cylinder, under the same pressure as before, you can fit about 10 times more gas in this same volume. So the CO2 or methane or hydrogen that you're putting in the cylinder would rather stick to the MOF surface than itself. So you get very high volumetric and gravimetric gas storage densities. So my group is somewhat focused on MOF synthesis and characterization for gas storage, but we're really excited about porous molecular materials to do this job. So kind of like this MOF synthesis, we can take an organic linker, react this with a metal salt, and these assemble in solution into now these molecular clusters. So instead of three-dimensional solids, they're just porous molecules. So here's an example we published recently. This chromium cage has a high surface area, it's very stable, and it absorbs a lot of methane. So shown on the bottom here, my group very commonly measures gas absorption properties. So we measure a lot of isotherms. Here it's showing that the methane uptake at room temperature in 65 bar is as good as many three-dimensional non-molecular solids. So they're very interesting from a storage standpoint, but because they're molecules, they're easier to make, easier to characterize, you can purify them, they're a lot more processable. So we're really excited to push the boundaries of gas absorption for storage or separations for these new materials. Now, whether we're using MOFs, these three-dimensional structures, or porous cages, my group is also interested in new materials for drug delivery. So MOFs, metal organic frameworks, have been used for this quite a bit. Here, for example, you can put a drug molecule within the pores of these highly porous structures, and under the right triggered release, whether it's exposure to moisture, certain pH changes, taken into a cell versus extracellular, we can tune when a drug molecule is released, so we can use this for targeted drug delivery. So my group is interested in doing this for pulmonary drug delivery, which is very topical now, obviously, delivering drug molecules selectively to certain parts of the lung. So here, for example, we're looking at UIO66. It's a zirconium-based MOF, and the important thing is if you want to deliver a drug to the pulmonary space, you need to be able to tune particle size, because where in your lungs these particles are delivered is largely governed by the size of the particles that you inhale. So here we can tune reaction conditions, including the metal to organic linker ratio and water content, and very precisely tune the particle size of these MOFs. In collaboration with Kathy Froman in chem engineering, we're actually looking at the biological side of this. So not only looking at the uptake of drugs by our MOFs, but also monitoring the release of these cargoes under certain physiological conditions. Recently, we've actually taken this to the next step and looked at in vitro and in vivo uptake of these. So you can see uptake by cells, the MOFs nanoparticles are taken up by cells, they're processed and discharged by the body. So these plots on the bottom here You can look at the PDF that's uploaded to look at them more closely, but we see after even just a couple days, these moth particles don't bioaccumulate. They're processed by the cells or the mice. And finally, the thing that my group is really interested in is a totally new class of materials. These are porous salts or porous liquids. So we're familiar with thinking about porosity in solids. So zeolites, cat litter is a type of zeolite. They're very porous structures. So as a solid, those are pretty common. But now start thinking about liquids that might have porosity. Porous liquids were first suggested about 10 years ago. And over the last couple of years, there's starting to be examples of them published in the literature. So my group is taking a new approach in making porous salts for these. So now you can think of a solid structure based on cations and anions, just a simple salt, where the cation is a porous cage and the anion is a porous molecule. And together, this makes a porous salt. So here's an example. Zirconium cationic cage plus a copper anionic cage gives us an amorphous, a non-crystalline sample. Spectroscopically, we can see that in XPS, IR, NMR, the product phase that we couldn't characterize initially is made up of these two different cage parent types. So my students do a lot of spectroscopic characterization, physical characterization, and importantly, crystallographic characterization. So we can use X-rays to determine the structure of this new porous salt, and it's based on just porous cations and porous anions. So now as a salt, really our next step is thinking about how can we get a melting point in this material. So ionic liquids are salts that have an accessible melting point near or slightly above room temperature. So we're trying now to create new ionic liquids based on porous cations and anions. So students working on this project will be at the forefront of making a totally new class of materials in porous ionic liquids. So you can see finally, the bottom picture is shown here. We're making tertiary or quaternary salts where we can mix multiple types of cations and or anions and get really ultimately tunable porous phases that are either solid salts or also perhaps porous liquids. So students in my group typically split their time between 1/3 organic synthesis, making new organic linkers, 1/3 material synthesis, so making new MOFs or cages, and finally probably 1/3 or so characterization. So it's a good mix of synthesis and characterization, but really we're inorganic chemists at heart, making new materials, trying to tackle problems related to energy, the environment, or human health. If you have any questions about my research, you can go to my website or email me, edb@udel.edu. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you here in the fall.